Hello and welcome to Module 2 of Deconstructing TUPE, when TUPE applies Part 2, Service Provision Changes. Now in Module 1 we looked at the first type of situation which gives rise to a TUPE transfer, which is a transfer of an undertaking or part of an undertaking. That's known as a standard transfer. In this module we'll look at the second type of situation which gives rise to a TUPE transfer, a service provision changeover. We'll look at the three ways a service provision change can take place. We'll look at what amounts to an organised grouping of employees, and we'll look at what amounts to fundamentally the same activities, as well as the problem of multiple contractors. A service provision change can happen in three ways. Number one, a company, the client, stops doing certain activities on its own behalf, such as commercial cleaning, and gets a contractor to do it instead. That's called outsourcing or contracting out. And the transfer here is from the client to the contractor. Type 2 is when the client changes which contractor does certain activities. This is known as re-tendering. So the transfer would be from the outgoing contractor, the one that's lost the contract, to the incoming contractor. And type 3 is where the client decides to take the work back in-house from a contractor, and that's called insourcing. And the transfer here is from the contractor back to the client. For example, let's take a company called Widgets plc. Widgets plc contract out their canteen and catering facilities, because a lot of this is always to do with outsourcing catering activities and also outsourcing cleaning activities. They're the two most common areas of contracting out. So Widgets plc contracts out its canteen and catering facilities to a contractor, Cooking Crew. The contract with Cooking Crew is now due to expire. If Widgets plc retender and change contractors, or take the catering service back in-house, that will be a service provision change and TUPE will apply. It was also, of course, a service provision change when they first contracted out the services to the subcontractor. Other conditions need to be satisfied for TUPE to apply to a service provision changeover. So there has to be an organised grouping of employees whose main purpose is to carry out those activities, cleaning, catering, whatever it might be, on behalf of the client. It's those employees in that organised grouping who will transfer. I'll come back to that in another module. Second, the activities have to be fundamentally the same before and after the transfer. Still got to be fundamentally the same cleaning activity, the same catering activity. And third, the client wants the contractor to carry out the activities on an ongoing basis, rather than for a single event or for a short term. I'll deal with that in Module 3. And fourth, which I'll also deal with in Module 3, the activities are not only related to the supply of goods. So I said there has to be an organised grouping of employees for this to apply, and it's that organised grouping that transfers. But what does organised grouping actually mean? Well, the requirement limits TUPE to situations where the outgoing contractor has a team of employees who are dedicated to the activities which will transfer. I say team, there's actually some case law that suggests one person is enough if they are dedicated to the contract. But if Cooking Crew always uses the same employees in Widget plc's kitchen and canteen, that's an organised grouping of employees. If the contractor changes, or the work is taken back in-house, TUPE will apply, provided the other parts of the test are met, and those employees, that dedicated organised grouping of employees, will transfer to the new employer, to the incoming contractor, or back to the original company. On the other hand, if say a courier company uses different couriers at different times to service a particular client, that's not an organised grouping of employees. If the client changes courier companies, TUPE will therefore not apply. To meet the test, employees have to be deliberately organised into a group which services the client. If work's assigned to people because of shifts they're on, rather than because they're assigned to a particular client's work, then this isn't and organised grouping. So, for example, in Eddie Stobart against Mormon, employees worked on a particular contract because their shifts coincided with the time that work needed doing. They spent most of their time on the contract, but they weren't deliberately assigned to it. A new company won the contract. Did the employees working on the new contract transfer to the new contractor? Well, the Employment Appeal Tribunal said no. They didn't, because the employees did the work because it happened to fall within their shift pattern, not because of any organised grouping. So TUPE didn't apply and they didn't transfer over. The activities before and after the transfer have to be fundamentally the same, but they don't need to be identical. So when it had the catering contract at Widgets plc, cooking crew cooked and served hot dinners in the staff canteen. When the contract ended, Widgets plc decided to stop providing hot food and instead have self-service fridges containing ready-prepared snacks and drinks. Cool Gang won that contract. TUPE is unlikely to apply to cooking crew's employees to transfer them from cooking crew to Cool Gang because the activities before and after the contract change, hot food to taking pre-prepared cold food out of fridge, the activities change and they're not fundamentally the same. That means that cooking crew's employees won't transfer to Cool Gang, which in turn means that cooking crew probably has to make them redundant and pay redundancy payments. There are good examples of this principle in case law. So in a case called Salvation Army and Bahi, the council, which is the main client, there was a council, contracted out its homelessness services to a company called CLL. CLL provided accommodation at various locations. They also provided support workers to help people with everyday tasks and issues. Now the council, which was the client, merged its homelessness and ex-offender support services. The Salvation Army won the new contract for the merged services. The Salvation Army provided their own different accommodation. They changed the referral system and they made minor changes to the services provided. But the core services were essentially the same: accommodation-based support for homeless people and the provision of support workers. The change to the premises and the tweaks to the nature of the services were not enough to make the activities provided by the Salvation Army fundamentally different from those provided by CLL. So there had been a service provision change and TUPE applied, which meant that all CLL's employees who were dedicated to that contract, TUPE transferred to the Salvation Army. Anybody dismissed was automatically unfairly dismissed. Now, the situation was different in a case called Nottinghamshire Healthcare against Hampshire. Residents were originally looked after by care workers in a care home. The care home closed, and residents were rehoused into their own homes and looked after there by a private care contractor. The nature of the care changed significantly from managing residents in an institution to supporting them in their own homes. Routines were different, and staff slept over in residents' homes rather than working active night shifts. The activities after the change were fundamentally different from before. Therefore, because the activities were fundamentally different, there'd be no service provision change, TUPE didn't apply, and the employees didn't transfer. Now, you'll see from these two decisions that the existence of a transfer is very, very fact-sensitive. The courts look in a common-sense way at whether the activities are essentially the same before and after the transfer. And sometimes, just sometimes, it can all be down to presentation of the case in a tribunal and how well your witnesses are prepared to give evidence and how well they perform on the day. If a contract is retendered and one contractor secures the work, that's still a service provision change and TUPE will apply. TUPE can still apply if more than one contractor takes on the work, provided it's clear where each employee will transfer. The key is to establish which part of the business the employee was assigned to and which contractor took over that work. But what if the work's allocated amongst several different contractors and the work is allocated randomly. Well, this happened in a case called London Care against Henry. Severcare provided home-based care to residents on behalf of the local authority. So the local authority contracted out to Severcare. Work was allocated geographically to Severcare's workers to minimise the travel between jobs and ensure continuity of care for the residents. Severcare lost the contract and the work was divided between 4 new contractors, including one called London Care. Was there a TUPE transfer due to a service provision change when Severcare's contract got split between 4 contractors? Well, the Employment Appeal Tribunal said no. The work had been given to 4 contractors and allocated on a random basis rather than geographically. It was impossible to tell where some of the employees should transfer because the residents they'd cared for were now being looked after by different companies. The service had become too fragmented. That's the key word, fragmented. The activities were not fundamentally the same because they'd fragmented into different pieces. They weren't fundamentally the same as before the contract change. Therefore, there was no TUPE transfer. Therefore, the employees of Severcare did not transfer. And therefore, Severcare remained employing them and either had to find new jobs for them or pay them statutory redundancy payments. Now, in Module 3, we're going to look at some situations where TUPE does not apply, despite it, on the face of it, falling within a business transfer of an economic entity that retains its identity, or a service provision change.